under my surveillance. My pot is popping and I'm hungry for more mayhem. I'm just letting y'all know that I'm outrageous. I make my stand in this forsaken land, and I'm gonna win, I'll beat 'em all. Give me what you got, I want more. Hey, hey, I'm the gas, baby. Yeah, pandemonium in my pulse. Have you ever seen a bee like me? That I think so. You know I'm so unique, and I'll show you all. You'll see. Let's go. At the explosion block. How many cases now? I've been out for ages, looking for the mayhem now. I'm tired of waiting. I got an even speed. I'm a speedy P. I move speedily from A to B. But I need to be reaching the top of the tree. I'm a lean green by the machine, and I know that there ain't nobody be stepping to me, 'cause they gonna.
कम हो रहा है जो दिन दिन थोड़ा थोड़ा कम हो रहा है उसके बाद प्रेशर था वो अभी और यहाँ आज भी अन्नदान चल रहा है हम दोनों रात में जाएंगे
It was like opening the door with brand new light. Today we're going to be talking about traction.
दो है करना है कल भी किया इतना डाल देखो
अरे ముందు వార్నింగ్ यार ముందు వార్నింగ్ ఇయ్యాలి కొంచెం వార్నింగ్ ఇయ్యాలి ముందు
साथ में ये मेरे कैमरा देख तो लीजिए ब्लैक एंड व्हाइट इतना काला कैसे हो गया जी ఇంత నల్లగా అయిపోయినా డిపెండ్ నల్లగా అయిపోయినారా
నేను నల్ల కాదు
అది చూడు కదా
అదే
ऐसे ही है
ముందు వార్నింగ్ కొంచెం తిడతాను ఎందుకు
అది ఎప్పుడు వాడితే 4 years back తీసుకున్నది డాడీ నీకు మంచిగా బట్టలు కలిస్తాను డాడీ నేను బట్టలు కలుస్తాను వాళ్ళు ప్రిపేర్ చేసిన
5 years na sir, మొత్తం తీసుకుంటారు. 4 years. 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 4 years
లేదు నల్లకోతున్నాం.
ఏముంటున్నాడంటే
బిజినెస్ ఓపెన్ చేస్తాం. వాడు బిజినెస్ ఓపెన్ చేస్తాం. చెమ్మటి చెక్క చెరడేసి చెప్పులు ఒకసారి చూసొద్దాం.
ఎక్కడికి
అన్నదానం
గట్టిగా అవ్వదు.
Madagascar, an island off the coast of Africa. It's one of the most biologically diverse places in the world. Almost all of its plants and animals aren't found anywhere else on Earth. And when we looked at it from space, we saw a spot. A massive dark circle, almost perfectly round, over 13 kilometers in diameter, and big enough that roads are diverted on either side of it. Looking at it from the side, we could see it was a mountain. And if you zoomed all the way in, you could see a village. Nestled in the crater at its center, 8 kilometers from the closest labeled town on Google Maps, isolated in a remote part of a remote region of a geographically isolated country. It looked like it could have been there for generations, but if you looked backward through time, each year it gets smaller and smaller. And before 2008, there was no one there at all. I wanted to try to answer one question. Why did these people move to such an incredibly isolated place? I was really starting from zero here. I didn't know in Madagascar, I didn't know much about Madagascar. But the question was, could we get in touch with people living here just by using it? The closest location tags were on the edges of the mountain, a butcher shop, a playground, and a historical landmark, but none of them were real. They all seemed to be random references to the popular Japanese manga and anime series Attack on Titan, written in Russian. The ones that did look real, churches, hospitals, and schools, didn't have much of a presence on the internet. So we looked at content that had been geotagged nearby, first on Twitter, using the coordinates of the village and a search radius. Until finally, at 12 kilometers away, we found someone, a nonprofit worker who had posted from a nearby village in 2014. We asked if he knew anything about the village on the mountain, but he never got back to us. On Instagram, we looked for pictures tagged in the nearest town, Antanaditra, and found an aid organization that had posted pictures taken there. We asked, but they didn't know. They'd never actually been on the mountain at all. And finally, we looked at geotags on YouTube, and there was a video. Geotagged right next to the village on the top of the mountain. But then it was just more Attack on Titan stuff, also written in Russian. After a while, it felt like the internet alone was not going to tell us very much. So we started reaching out to experts who had worked in Madagascar. Experts in agriculture.
Vous voulez parler du cercle là? Je suis jamais allée dans la zone que vous pointez là, je ne saurais expliquer trop.
And experts in biogeography.
I don't know people working in that region, frankly. It's in the middle of nowhere.
Madagascar is a country of almost 29 million people, slightly more than Australia, slightly fewer than Texas, and the majority of the country's population, over 60%, lives in rural settings a lot like this one. But this village was particularly remote. If you zoom out, the closest major city is a place called Siroanamandid, 18 kilometers away, with a population of over 44,000. At this point in the process, it felt like we might need to take a more drastic approach. Maybe we could hire someone to make the journey up the mountain to the village itself. Someone in Madagascar. That's how we met Lali. Lali runs a production company in Madagascar, in the capital city of Antananarivo. She was down to make the trip. She started to gather a crew, make local contacts, and figure out how to get from Antananarivo all the way here. They weren't exactly sure yet how they would get up to the village, or how they'd establish contact once they got there.
Need an introduction to them if someone is from the area.
Yeah. But they knew they were going to have to do it in just a few days in the middle of Madagascar's hot, rainy season. And early one morning in January, they went.
She's Sina, she's going to be our guide. This is Yaz, he's an historian. This is Bull, our fixer. This is José, our very focused driver, and this is me, you know me already.
As they approached the mountain, Lali sent us messages every step of the way.
So we finally found the crater. It's just down there, and we are going to film it.
Until finally, after traveling 10 kilometers by motorcycle and on foot, they made it to the top of the mountain. when they got there, and were about to descend to the village in the crater, a massive storm appeared on the horizon. And they had to turn back. They got extremely close, but making contact with the village would have to wait until the end of the rainy season, which was in May, 4 months away. Still, all the research we'd done so far gave us a detailed idea of what this place looked like. What Lolly's team did see looked green, lush, and clearly extremely difficult to access. But there was still so much we didn't know. Before Lolly went in January, she wasn't convinced that anybody lived there at all. There's the small group of houses at the very top and the very middle that we've kind of been interested in.
It's not possible to live there, and especially because there are earthquakes.
So I turned to some very basic Googling, and I found an article about earthquakes in Madagascar. The article described how a team of researchers mapped Madagascar via seismic tomography. That's tomography, not topography, because it's mapping the Earth's interior, not exterior, like a CT scan for the planet. All of these measurements produced this final map of the entire island, with colors labeling the different ages and kinds of rock. And here, in the center of the map, I could see one perfectly circular dot. I pulled it into Photoshop, overlaid it with the map, and it lined up with the mountain exactly. According to the key, that meant that the mountain dated back to the Cretaceous period, sometime between 66 and 145 million years ago. And it was volcanic. This looked like a very, very extinct volcano, but we wanted to know for sure. So I started looking for a volcano expert from Madagascar who could explain it to me. And that led me to Salah Raharimiyev. He showed me a map
Can you see it?
from a detailed geological survey of the area.
That circular structure is actually made of rocks that form deep within the surface. It has been dated using uranium-lead geochronology dating techniques and is actually 90 million years old.
90 million years old. Older than Mount Everest, the Grand Canyon, Vesuvius. This thing was ancient. 90 million years meant that this thing had been extinct for a very, very long time. But that number was significant for another reason.
That is actually overlapping on the India and Madagascar separation.
Okay, Salah was talking about this moment, right here, when India broke apart from Madagascar. Because these rocks are 90 million years old, it makes sense that the volcano might have something to do with this massive separation of continents. So we went looking for experts who knew more about the breakup of Madagascar and India. And we found Joe Mears, a geology professor who's written a bunch about the movement of formation. This was a real crash course on volcanic geology, so I asked our motion design Matt to help me sort of top up.
Madagascar and India happen to be located beneath this really deep-seated mantle source. They're called plumes.
When that plume reaches the planet's crust, it forms a hotspot.
As Madagascar moved up in the hotspot, it burned a hole through Madagascar and produced all the volcanics all over the island.
As Madagascar's continental plate continued to move, those volcanoes were eventually cut off from the hotspot. And without a heat source, they cooled and collapsed.
And then you're left with the plumbing system that was underneath that volcano.
So that's what we were looking at, the collapsed remnants of a volcano formed by a hotspot that had broken up Madagascar in India. At this point, I had no idea what any of this might have to do with the village that we could see on Google Earth. But right about then, we heard back from another Malagasy expert we emailed. He sent us a link to mindat.org. This is like a Wikipedia of minerals and mines, and it had a page about the mountain, including its name, the Ambohibi Massif. Finally, we knew the name of this mountain that had been unlabeled on every other map we'd seen so far, and we could search for it. We found maps from 1899, 1903, and 1916, where the Ambohibi was always labeled as a lush forest, the only one for almost 100 kilometers. That definitely didn't seem to be the case anymore, but maybe these old trees were a clue. We kept looking, and we found old reports One from 1933 said that at the highest part of the massive, there is a very open valley called by the indigenous Andronomangatsiaka, or where we find fresh water. Water. Maybe that's why the villagers chose to move there. The mountain's higher elevation meant that it got more moisture, feeding these streams that flowed down the mountain in every direction, and making the center a perfect place for a village to thrive. Then we tried to find reports that were a little bit more recent, and on Google Scholar, we found a 2012 paper about the origins of the Yambo-Hibi. It covered everything from the geochemistry to plate tectonics to microscopic images of its rocks, and it included rock samples taken right next to the crater village. The paper was written by a South African geoscientist named Ndibuo Cecilia Mukosi, and if she took rock samples from right here, when the village already looked like this, she had to have been in contact with the people living there. Mukosi was busy doing field research for the next few days, so in the meantime, we dug deeper into her paper, and it told us what the formation actually was: an alkaline ring complex. Alkaline refers to the chemistry of the magma. It's the kind of molten rock that appears when continents break apart, like Madagascar and India did 90 million years ago. I took this new term and looked at dozens more across the world. In Sudan, Egypt, Niger, Russia, Namibia, Zimbabwe, the United States, they were everywhere. A whole planet covered in circles, the remnants of long extinct volcanoes. I wanted to talk to someone who could tell me why a community of people would want to live on top of an alkaline ring complex. So I went looking for the most famous researcher of the most famous alkaline ring complex out there. That's when this caught my eye. The Richat structure, also called the Eye of the Sahara. It's an alkaline ring complex in Mauritania surrounded by conspiracy theories, even on Google Maps, where it's littered with comments saying that it's the site of Atlantis and that nobody knows what it is. But geologist Michel Jabrac does know what it is. He's done tons of research there and even helped get an illustration of it onto Mauritania's currency.
Alcalins, les alcalins en géologie, c'est le potassium, le sodium et le calcium. Pour l'agriculture, le calcium, c'est excellent. Ce qui veut dire que je ne serais pas surpris que la ferme elle se place au milieu parce que les roches sont plus calcaires dans cette niveau-là. Ça, c'est un bonheur pour une agriculture africaine. Parce qu'on a de l'engrais sur place, tout simplement.
Soil. Maybe that was why they moved here. This alkaline ring complex formed when continents broke apart, left behind a valley with remarkably fertile soil. There was one last person who might know something about the community living on top of the Yambo-Hibi complex, Ndibuo Cecilia Mukosi, the geoscientist who had studied it. When she was back from doing field research, we spoke.
I was first or second person to map the Yambo-Hibi complex and try to understand how it was formed. It's quite fertile, and so the area is good for agriculture.
One of the things that really caught us in the first place about this location was the fact that at the crater of the ring complex there is what looks like a farm right in the very middle. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, you sent me that there wasn't people living on the center of the complex. I think this is quite recent, and I was there 15 years ago. Things change after a while.
I'd missed this the whole time. Mukosi's research was published in 2012, but she had actually visited the Yambo-Hibi 5 years earlier, in 2007, before anyone had moved here in the first place. So that was it. We'd been trying to learn about this incredibly remote village in an incredibly remote part of the country, and the one person who had formally studied it most recently had done so before the village even existed. We had all this research and we were stunned. But now the rainy season was over, and we finally had a chance to send Lali and crew to make the journey again.
Hi Christopher, we are leaving now, so we are heading to Tiamat. We are now on the way.
Lali brought a whole new team, including Rado Andriamanis, a filmmaker who captured scenes as they drove through the Madagascar countryside. of pineapple vendors, basket weavers, and rice farmers.
We are 1 hour and 45 minutes approximately from Tirumandid.
Tirumandid, the closest major city to the Ambohibi. When they made it there, they picked up their final crew member, Zohar, a Tirumandid local who would be their guide.
Hello, can you hear me now?
He told me he'd climbed the Ambohibi many times, and he wrote his master's thesis on its water resources, but had never been to the village its center.
Straight to
Antanditra, just 8 kilometers away. From there, they could travel to interview people living on the outskirts of the massif, the crater village's closest neighbors. The crew asked them what they thought made this place special.
Tena loharano tsara madio be zany le resaka ambohiby. Tany mamokatra ary dia tany mbola ampivelomany le taranaka faramandimby.
Tany mahatsara azy le rano, tsara rano.
They'd met the people living closest to the crater village, but climbing all the way up the mountain would take a full day. Early the next morning, they set off for one last shot at reaching the village.
What you see behind me, there, this line, there, the crater. It's like in the middle of nowhere. It's a beautiful nowhere, but still.
Until at last, they arrived.
So we are now reaching the crater.
And they saw the village, up close, full of dozens of houses, livestock, and people. But as soon as they drove closer, things became tense.
Some people in the village think that we are a team of spies coming to take them guilty for something. So we are waiting for someone to do this facilitation. We still need to wait.
After 2.5 hours, one of the town's leaders came to talk.
We finally succeed to find our facilitator.
Nianarako dia misy Samuel natoko fanomezan-tsoa. Trano eo amin'ny 50 tafo eo ary ny mponinety zany hatramin'ny ankizy tonga amin'ny olon-dehibe mahatratra eo amin'ny 300 isa eo.
It still wasn't clear why they chose this place in particular, somewhere so remote. Until they sat down to interview Raza Finitiala, one of the village's elders.
Nahatonga anay ny amin'ity toerana ity dia noho ny fikaramana fitadiavana vola izaho nandray zakokandro ny patron tenisy rakotoary velo teo Tirumandid dia nahita an'ity aho dia tsy avy ratanana manotany aho ny dadan'ireto ratoko dadan'ny ratoko ny radany tsisy tany malalaka ve aza tsisy tany malalaka Pakistani cara setia bulan malalaka dia zay nangyayari dia
And they gave it a name.
Anoshbe Ambohibi.
Anoshbe Ambohibi, or Big Island Country.
Atony nahatonga ny anarana ho Anoshbe Ambohibi ho bibin'ny rano atsimo varatra ndraiky anatsinany.
So we had an answer about why they lived here and why they had traveled all this way to live in a place like this. It was for the water, and it was for the soil, but more than anything else, it was for space. And it's easy to see why. In the entire district of Tirumandid, there are about 49 people per square kilometer. But in the migrants' original home of Manandriana, that density is more than twice as high. And for farmers like them, space to plant, to breed livestock, though life is everything. And then the villagers took Lolly and the crew to see what they'd done with all of that space. A massive field of hundreds of lemon and orange trees.
Efa trany amin'ny Roumanie zay no manana champ de culture ohatr'izao ihany.
The citrus are a cash crop, fruits grown for the purpose of selling at a market. But to sell their produce at a market, they have to transport it down the mountain to Antanaditra, the same difficult journey that Lolly and her team had just done.
Nefa zavatra lalana 11 kilometra zany dia mahatsiaro sahirana kely mihitsy izay mponina eto amin'le aratsindalana zany na amin'ny resaka moto na resaka fivezena moto sy ny tomobile zany somary sahirana mihitsy izay eto.
Ny ahtana ihany zany dia falifaly zahay amin'ny famokarana na amin'ny fiompiana fa kosa ato amin'ny resaka lalana sy fahamoaka an'ilay zavatra sasarana no zao tena mampalahelo ny anakavy.
Remoteness was the thing that first fascinated us about this village, and it was a central part of their story. But it was a story that stretched far beyond this place. Madagascar has some of the least developed road networks in the world, with just 5 kilometers of road per 100 square kilometers of land. The majority of Madagascar's population lives in rural areas a lot like this one. But only a tiny fraction of that rural population lives within 2 kilometers of a road that's usable all year long, which means that almost 16 million people live essentially unconnected. Having better, more connected roads means an easier time accessing schools, hospitals, and markets, an easier time building a better life.
Hey, hi Christopher, how you doing? We've been to the crater finally. They live in a very, very, very remote area because it's like the center of the crater. And the way they live in the middle of the crater and they can sustain themselves, it's amazing. But to access there, it's not an easy life.
When I was going through all the footage Lolly's team sent us after they made it home, I couldn't stop looking at this perfect match to the first image we saw of the village. And it struck me. Apart from a few photos taken with cameras hundreds of kilometers up in the sky, there's basically no record of Anoshbe Amboibi anywhere on the internet. Until right now. With the internet, we can look at just about any part of the planet. Some of the places we find might be made up, or might be surrounded by conspiracy theories instead of facts. And some we can't learn much about at all without showing up, asking questions, and letting the people there tell their story. I'm in the middle of the countryside in Uruguay, trying to find this. A forest shaped like a fingerprint. We're here because of a screenshot of Google Earth that somebody posted to Reddit. In 2022, a Reddit user named Tarek619 found strange DNA-like forests spanning some 30 kilometers in Uruguay. I looked at the forest. I wasn't totally sure what was DNA-like about it, but it was strange. And then I zoomed out and saw that it was just part of a whole array of forests, all in mesmerizing designs. Then I zoomed out more. Forests like this covered the entire country, but I couldn't stop looking at this one. It looked like a fingerprint. From Street View, I could just barely make out what it was. Long rows of identical trees. If I wanted to see inside one of these forests, I would have to go see it for myself. So I went and discovered something much more complex than I expected. But it all started with one question. Why did this forest look like a fingerprint? Before I left, I started with some highly advanced research methods. And I started reading. According to a Uruguayan government report, about 1 million of Uruguay's 17 million hectares of land are covered with pine and eucalyptus plantations. Tree farms. Artificial forests. That's why they were planted in these rows of identical trees. Reading more, I learned that the majority of those trees are turned into pulp. Not pulp like orange juice, pulp like wood pulp. Soft, wet, chemically separated cellulose that becomes the main ingredient in making paper products. Printing paper, paper towels, toilet paper, napkins, anything. And according to the very first result on Google search, these forests were a miracle. On a continent devastated by deforestation,